The year was 1998, and in a story largely ignored by the media, something unthinkable was about to befall the city home to England's second oldest cathedral. The city was relegated to the status of town. But what was the bizarre chain of events that led up to this? To truly understand the scope of it, we need to go back. All the way back, about 2,000 years or so. Welcome to Rochester, in the county of Kent. To the Romans, though, it went by the name Duro Breve. Even before they settled here, they knew the area well, as it was a few miles from here that the Battle of Medway took place. It's virtually impossible to overstate the importance of this battle. It took place in the year 43 AD, when the Claudian invasion of Britain was just beginning. Before the Romans zigzagged their way from the coast of Kent to their first capital of Colchester, in modern terms, they met with resistance at the River Medway, i.e. the river you're looking at. Historians estimate that the Romans numbered around 45,000, whilst the native Britons were around 150,000 strong, which, if true, would make this close to 10 times the numbers seen at the Battle of Hastings. Either way, a monumental amount, and more so still considering the likely population of the 1st century AD. The battle was equally monumental, raging on for 2 days before the Romans finally prevailed. The Britons retreated towards the Thames. The Romans would later return to this area, where they were able to bridge the Medway and establish their fort here, known as Duro Breve, which may have felt to them like a symbolic victory in itself. But the Roman occupation wasn't to last, and by the early 5th century they withdrew from Britain. The next to settle on these shores were the Anglo-Saxons, although in the case of Kent they were technically neither Anglo nor Saxon, but rather Jutes, a Germanic people thought to have come from what equates to northern Denmark in modern geographic terms. In 595 AD, Pope Gregory the Great sent a Roman monk named Augustine on a mission to the British Isles to convert the largely pagan population of the time to Christianity. This culminated in Augustine becoming the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Augustine sent fellow missionary by the name Justus around 25 miles west to Rochester. Here, in 604 AD, Justus became the first Bishop of Rochester. Kent was still a kingdom during this time. King Ethelbert had granted permission to Justus to establish a church here, which became his bishop's seat. Thus, Rochester could arguably claim to be the second oldest city in the country in the ecclesiastical sense, except for the somewhat major issue of it only being a town today, but more on that later. When the Normans conquered England in 1066, they began to build castles across the land to assert their authority. Rochester Castle is one such example, and just so happens to boast the tallest medieval stone keep in England, which at 113 feet, or 34 metres tall, still dominates the skyline along the River Medway even to this day. The Normans also rebuilt Rochester Cathedral on more or less the exact spot of its predecessor. The present cathedral was consecrated in 1130 with Henry I in attendance. 85 years later, a rather bizarre chapter unfolded just across the road at the castle. The year was 1215, and King John's leadership was in the process of being undermined by rebel barons during the First Barons' War. The rebels had garrisoned the castle in order to block John's approach to London. What followed was a 2-month-long siege, and one in which the barons appeared to be holding out until John unleashed his secret weapon. 40 pigs. By burning the fat from, quote, 40 pigs too fat to eat, John's forces were able to dislodge the masonry of the southeast tower from underground and ultimately starve the rebels out of the castle, although it probably put them off bacon for life. Anyway, in 1227, Rochester's city status was officially recognised in a royal charter during the reign of Henry III. The city itself was, and still is, focused largely around one street in particular. Whilst today it goes by the mundane name of High Street, a more historic name applies here, and that name is Watling Street. This is one of the most important Roman roads in the country, arguably the most important. I say Roman road, but it is speculated to have started off as an ancient Celtic trackway. If this is true, it could be inferred that the Romans actually followed it here before facing off against the Britons at the Battle of Medway. In any case, throughout the entirety of Rochester's history, Watling Street has linked it to both London and Canterbury in more or less a straight line. In other words, Rochester is roughly equidistant between the two, making it the perfect resting stop for travellers, and after Thomas Becket was murdered at Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, he became a martyr, and thus Canterbury became a place of pilgrimage. So, for any pilgrims heading there from London, as per the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, Rochester would have been a natural place to rest up halfway. By the Georgian period, the first ever form of public transport was catching on, the stagecoach. Towns long on established routes, such as Rochester, became staging posts, i.e. points where horses could be changed. To accommodate this industry, coaching inns were built, just like this one, the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel. Its wide archway is one of the telltale signs of its former use, when the four horses pulling the coach would trot on through, and an ostler, spelt O-S-T-L-E-R, would arrange a fresh set of legs, and indeed hooves, for the ongoing journey after the passengers were sufficiently fed and rested. Incidentally, one of the former guests at the Royal Victoria and Bull Hotel was none other than Charles Dickens, who featured the hotel in the Pickwick Papers and Great Expectations. But the Dickens connection goes far deeper, as this was the town, nay, city, in which the great author spent his latter years. He would often use real-life locations in his works, albeit sometimes disguised with fictional names. To that end, Rochester became Cloisterham in Dickens's final unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. This featured various real-life buildings in this Dickensian parallel universe, such as Mr. Sapsea's house, an auctioneer who becomes mayor of Cloisterham, Mr. Tope's house, the verger of Cloisterham Cathedral, and Miss Twinkleton's Academy for Young Ladies. Sadly, the mystery of Edwin Drood would remain a mystery, as Dickens died in 1870 before penning the final chapters. However, a story stranger than fiction would befall Rochester just over 100 years later. So, to explain the circumstances leading to Rochester's lost city status, we need first to zoom out a little and take a quick tour of the neighbouring towns, since these are a large contributing factor. First off, just opposite Rochester, on the west bank of the Medway, is the town of Strood. This has a distinctly modern feel to it, but it does boast some nice views of, well, Rochester from across the river. Then, to Rochester's immediate east, separated by nothing at all, is the town of Chatham. This is famous for its former dockyard, where hundreds of Royal Navy ships were built, including HMS Victory. It was also where Dickens spent part of his childhood, perhaps explaining why he gravitated back to the area later in life. Just northeast of Chatham is Gillingham, a town into which Chatham Dockyard expanded, and one which grew rapidly from the 19th century onwards. Finally, just southeast of Gillingham is Rainham. This was a tiny village at the first census of 1801, but like Gillingham, grew significantly. Essentially, these five settlements expanded towards one another, forming a conurbation. In 1974, the city of Rochester became part of a new borough, namely the Borough of Medway. This included the former Borough of Chatham and part of the former rural district of Strood. At the request of the outgoing city council before the merger, the Queen granted letters patent which maintained the status of Rochester as a city within the Borough of Medway. The borough's name was changed twice, first in 1979 to Rochester upon Medway Borough Council, then in 1982 to Rochester upon Medway City Council. The latter came with further letters patents declaring that, quote, the whole of the said borough and not the said parts of the borough as heretofore should have the name, style and status of a city. Stay with me here. In 1998, Rochester upon Medway City Council and the neighbouring Gillingham Borough Council, which also included Rainham, were both abolished, and in their place, A new unitary authority was formed, going by the name Medway Council, essentially merging all 5 Medway towns into one single local authority. The government provided advice as to the steps it needed to take in order to retain city status. The crux of the matter being that city status has only ever been granted in the name of established towns, and as Medway is not a town but a unit of local government, it became no longer eligible for city status, whereas the previous council that went by the name Rochester upon Medway did fit this condition. So the abolition of Rochester upon Medway in favour of the new merger effectively abolished its city status as well, which came with no public notice or consultation. Evidently, the required course of action would have been to appoint charter trustees to maintain the existence of the city. But, 2020 hindsight and all that. Now, my opinion, for what it's worth, is this downgrade is ludicrous and a case of bureaucracy gone mad. There's something very un-British about denying city status to a town with an ancient cathedral that's been Anglican since the Reformation. But perhaps, much like the mystery of Edwin Drood, this story also isn't over. Towns can of course apply for city status on certain occasions, such as a jubilee. So will this ancient cathedral town, with a bishop's seat over 1,400 years old, one day become a city again? That's up to the town itself to apply, and in which case would ultimately be for His Majesty the King to decide. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.